Great. Good morning, everyone. Hello, world. I'm Kristin Gilliss Moyer from the Mulago Foundation. Mulago invests in scalable solutions to the basic needs of the very poor, and we are delighted to host you online and these 5 great leaders willing to share thoughts on transforming conservation today. This conversation builds on yesterday's great dialogue that you probably saw many of our speakers participate in as part of the Smithsonian's Earth Optimism Digital Summit. Happy 50th Earth Day to everybody this week. Today we're going to hear from everyone. We're going to have time for questions. Please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Include your name, your organization, and the country you're joining us from today. Our speakers are joining us from Bolivia, UK, US, Brazil, and Kenya. So our topic today is transforming conservation, crisis and opportunity. We are in a moment of crisis, the pandemic, of course, but the sad reality, which our speakers talked about yesterday, is that a potential response to that is which crisis? Biodiversity loss, fisheries collapse, climate change. Against this tsunami of layered crises, as Fred said yesterday, we need transformative, not incremental change in conservation. So this is a deep dive session on what that looks like, and how we're going to do it. So let's dive in. First, we're going to hear how the crisis has affected our speakers and their organizations, more their organizations than them personally. You can always submit your personal questions online. And then we're going to tackle the question of accelerating the pace of widespread solutions that work. So first up, we're going to chat with Al and Leela. Dr. Alasdair Harris is the founder and executive director of Blue Ventures. And Dr. Leela Hazzah is founder and executive director of Lion Guardians. Doctors, welcome. I'm going to say something really briefly about both of your organizations, just so you don't have to. It's fun for me to get to share some of the good stuff. So Blue Ventures catalyzes locally led conservation across the Indian Ocean. Their main point of entry into conservation is helping coastal communities rebuild fisheries, but they also work in blue carbon, aquaculture, and community health. Their small-scale fisheries management models have gone to scale nationally in Madagascar and since been replicated in more than 10 other countries, reaching hundreds of thousands of people around the globe. Lion Guardians promotes the coexistence of people and lions across Africa. In the Maliasili ecosystem where they work, lion density has increased more than 7-fold. One of the only places outside of protected areas in Africa where the lion population is increasing, and the number of lions killed has dropped more than 90%. First of all, congratulations to both of you for everything that you've achieved. This is the Earth Optimism Summit, so we should celebrate all the victories and wins. And I think it would actually be really helpful just to hear from both of you, like if you had to say what your end game is, like what is success? What is your vision of success for Blue Ventures? How will we know you've succeeded? Al, what would it be? And don't forget to unmute yourself.
That's a big question. Thanks for the intro and thanks for inviting me to share today. I think our end game, our vision of success is quite simple. It's a world where the inshore coastal waters around the tropical oceans, which are home to a staggering amount of our world's biodiversity, are managed and protected effectively by the people that depend on them.
Great. And Leela, if you could add Lion Guardians' vision of success too.
Okay, the Lion Guardians vision is definitely, for us, it's a world where local communities are embedded in the fabric of conservation, and lions and other threatened wildlife populations are thriving and connected. Great.
So those are both big visions. There's so much you've achieved, and there's so much more you need to do to get to that vision. So in the context of this crisis, at Mulago, we think every organization has to ask itself right now how it will survive. You can't get to that vision if you don't survive. How it will maintain its impact, and how it will maybe directly respond. So survive the crisis, maintain your impact, and respond directly if appropriate. Let's start with survive. It strikes me there's an extra layer in there for both of you. Your work is anchored in fostering community-led conservation as the driver of the conservation impact you want. So you don't just need your organizations to survive, which they will, and you're both really lucky to be in that position that not every organization is right now. But you also need the community organizations that you partner with to survive, because you've invested so much in building that social capital. What's it like to have your impact interwoven with the success of those community organizations, and how are you thinking now about community resiliency where you work? Leela, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, it's something that as an organization we're thinking about, and I think that our work is even more critical right now because communities are not on any priority list of any relief activities, yet they are so impacted by the loss of, let's say, employment. Tourism camps have closed down. They also share the space with wildlife, so supporting them to minimize loss from the conflict is probably even more critical now, while other sources of livelihoods are limited.
Yeah, great answer. Al, do you want to add to that?
I think resiliency is being put into a sharp relief by the crisis that we're seeing. If we think about Blue Venture's mission, most of the people in the world that depend on fishing live in the tropics. Most of the world's biodiversity is in the tropics, and most of that is located in low-income countries. The pandemic, we know, will disproportionately affect the poor. So I think this pandemic is exposing the vulnerability of isolated and often marginalized rural communities in our cases, and it's intensifying the horrors of environmental collapse. In some respects, and I don't mean to underplay the enormity of the challenge that we're facing, it does provide a forewarning of the kinds of economic and socioeconomic and social shocks that will come with more rapid environmental and climate breakdown. From our perspective, it highlights the absolutely fundamental imperative of human-centered approaches to conservation that bolster, that shore up that resilience in the face of the shocks. So
let me ask you a question about that, because Al had a piece published in Manga Bay this week that everyone should read that said COVID underscores the urgency of holistic, community-based approaches to conservation. What did you mean by that?
I mean that for us as a conservation organization, safeguarding the world's most biodiverse oceans requires bolstering the resilience and the ability of communities that depend on that biodiversity to respond to shocks and to manage that biodiversity in a way that will benefit us. We've used this language within our organization for 2 decades, within our sector for a lot longer than that. And for us, it truly is a moment of reckoning to establish whether or not we're delivering. Do our models truly help communities in a time of need? Do they support their resilience? I think from a community perspective also, we as an organization are well placed to respond because we put an enormous emphasis on grassroots presence and ability. And when international and domestic transport and infrastructure and logistics are breaking down, never has that been more important. The kinds of rural infrastructure and capability that the partners that we support are building are absolutely essential. And we're also seeing to some extent the elephant in the room of the conservation sector, which is this North-South partnership and the balance of resources between those local organizations who are now on the front line and able to respond. And what I refer to in that article as using a term from Fred Nelson, the inefficient global apparatus of conservation, which I think we should also talk about if there's time.
Wonderful. Leela, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do, because I love this about, it's like we could be talking about what we're doing, so it's like perfect, because I think that like dealing in our area, making sure communities are healthy through this is so important, because just imagine when you're sick, you're not tolerant at all. Like, if whatever happens, you don't get your milk on time, you get really angry. So what happened if with these communities, they lost their prize bull, they get really angry, right? And so we're always talking about this kind of threshold of tolerance. And so, we've just given out thousands, 3,000-4,000 bars of soaps because we want to make sure people are healthy. And when Maasai are choosing to buy a bar of soap or to buy some milk, they're choosing the milk. They're never buying the bar of soap. So it's like, this is a way we can help them. And it is helping them to become more resilient and more tolerant for the loss they are going to have to predators in their area. So yeah, I just wanted to add it up.
Yeah, that's a great example of a type of direct response that you're actually doing connected
Yeah.
to still wanting to maintain your impact. So if we switch to thinking about how you're going to maintain your impact through this crisis and then beyond, you know, the Lions probably didn't get a memo that Kenya's on lockdown, right? So how do you continue the important work you've been doing when this pandemic is kind of surrounding that work?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, lions definitely don't stop eating livestock, like during a pandemic, unfortunately. You know, I think this idea, I think there's a thought that we're going to lose momentum through this, but we're not. I mean, if anything, we've increased our momentum because we need to, because a lot of the other NGOs have left, right? A lot of people can't move around. We've been designated as an essential service from the government, which means we can still do the work that we do. So, but we're one of the only ones in our area. And so I would say that 90% of our team are actually directly involved in conflict mitigation right now on the ground, and supporting the communities that are impacted by living with this wildlife. I also think that, other key members continue to kind of modify the actions in our strategic plan so we can stay relevant and impactful, because there's so much that's changing and there's so many unknowns that we can't just kind of pretend we're doing business as usual, because that doesn't even make sense. So I think we're probably doing a lot more than we usually do even. So
And Al, what about for Blue Ventures? I think, we haven't had as much time to talk about the details of how everyone's solution works, but so much of what you do is help communities understand that good fisheries management pays dividends, literally, for them, and is connected to their livelihood. At this moment, when livelihood is, a kind of a crushing concern, how can you maintain your impact and help communities continue to invest in good fisheries management right now?
It's a really good question. And indeed, seafood markets are being annihilated by the economic shocks that we're seeing. And livelihood diversification and resiliency is being put into such stark relief by this crisis. This really is that moment of reckoning for whether or not the diversification schemes that our organization has been working on, for example, through aquaculture to produce products that are perhaps more durable and less dependent on fresh markets, can survive and can diversify that income. We also have a health program, a community health program, that is pivoting its response to enable communities to reduce transmission of the virus and protect the most vulnerable, and strengthening health systems and so on. Health responses can also, of course, strengthen community trust and mean that communities are better able to work on more effective marine resource management. So on the livelihoods front and the health front, there's never been a more important time for our work. That said, social distancing does make community engagement pretty difficult. We're having to pivot a lot of our operations to a more digital interaction. From a partner perspective, we're finding a huge need for cash. The partners that we are supporting need more than ever unrestricted financial support to weather their own perturbations, and they're not able to access the kind of philanthropy that larger international, more visible conservation organizations are eligible for. We're also seeing a need for information sharing, establishing a clearinghouse mechanism for what works within our sector, which is the tropical small-scale fisheries space. There's a huge amount of learning out there across our international partnership network that we can draw on and should be elevating and amplifying, so that the voices of these very vulnerable groups don't go unheard at this really, really critical time.
Yeah, good. So, Blue Ventures started in Madagascar in 2003. Unfortunately, you've seen all types of crises since that time, from political challenges to cyclones, and you have adapted. So what lessons have you learned from past crises that you are drawing on now, or how is this one different?
That's possibly the subject for a separate webinar, but the resiliency of organizations never ceases to amaze me. We will get through this one. We won't look the same. It's an opportunity for transformative change. We've kind of got to make the most of it. Communications internally and externally are key. Of course, our own finances and our financial situation is imperiled by this. Our ability to deliver our own work to the timeframes that we've committed to is seriously compromised. So I'm spending a huge amount of time managing expectations for those that are supporting our work. We're having to make massive decisions really quickly about the viability of some of the work that we're doing, where our whole R&D process underpinning the assumptions that we're making about the viability of our livelihood work is being fast-tracked. Decisions that we want to make in the course of several PhDs are now having to be made overnight, as we try to do something to compensate for the fact that seafood markets, particularly for export, have literally disappeared. Tourism as well is another example of a market that is responsible for so many livelihoods that's made up almost overnight.
Yeah, for lion guardians too, I'm sure. Well, I have confidence that you're going to adapt this time too and come out stronger. This is the Earth Optimism Summit. So Leela, I think optimism is really a combination of hopefulness and confidence about the future. Can you share an example from Lion Guardian's work or your experience that gives you hope and confidence about the future in the place where you're working?
Sure. I mean, I feel like I have so many great examples. So, I mean, I think, when I think about when we first started, nearly 15 years ago, our hope was to save kind of one lion at a time. But we never imagined we'd be in this place where we have a booming lion population that's gone from a sink to a source now. And like, we just want them to disperse and move out to other areas. It's such an exciting place to be. And I don't think we also ever imagined that, that some of the most notorious lion killers that we recruited back then would now be some of the best lion conservationists on the entire continent. So that kind of incredible behavior change, I think, is where my optimism comes from. A lot of my optimism comes from to actually watch that shift is pretty incredible. And I'm excited about how we can scale that. And, we've been doing that for the last 10 years, really, is kind of codifying the best parts of like what has worked for us and how to share that knowledge across the globe, not just in Africa and not just with lions. And that's a really exciting space to be, because I think people are starting to get away from kind of this competitiveness and much more into a more holistic way of looking at conservation, where it's not site specific or species specific, but like it's talking about the larger environmental crisis we're in and how we can kind of work on solving the different pieces together. So that's exciting. I'm really hopeful.
Great. So thank you, Alan, Leela. We're going to hear more from you in our group discussion in a bit. I want to bring Lúcia and Maria Teresa into the conversation. So Dr. Lúcia Lohmann is Executive Director of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. She's also faculty at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. Maria Teresa Vargas is Executive Director of Fundacion Natura in Bolivia. I'll share a little bit about both of your work as well. So Fundacion Natura helps set up reciprocal water agreements where beneficiaries of downstream municipal water sources pay for upstream conservation. They have worked with more than 60 mayors across municipalities in Bolivia, and they've convinced 500,000 water users downstream to sign agreements with those upstream landowners that conserve over 1 million acres of water producing forest. The Association of Tropical Biology and Conservation, no matter how I try to think of other words to describe it, is exactly what it sounds like. It's an association of the world's tropical biologists. It has over 1,000 members and aims to foster understanding of tropical ecosystems and the role that they play in planetary health. Lúcia is also faculty, where her research centers around documenting biodiversity in poorly known tropical regions of the globe and using that information as a basis for new conservation priorities. So I'm going to start with the same question for each of you. Lúcia, what is your organization's vision of success?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. Such an exciting conversation. So our vision of success is really a world where everyone has a clear understanding of the importance of biodiversity and of our natural ecosystems, including well-informed leadership that is composed of diverse voices that are able to accommodate different players and different stakeholders.
Great. And Maria Teresa, same question for you. Don't forget to take yourself off mute.
Thank you for having me today. The world that I see is where communities protect and conserve water supplies that they live on, and they understand the value of these water supplies and the generosity of nature with them. By doing so, they are food secure, but water secure too.
Great, thank you. So Maria Teresa, like Al and Leela, your work is very closely tied to communities as the stewards and guardians of the ecosystems where they live. What does this crisis mean for the communities that you work with right now? And why are you optimistic that they'll act in accordance with those agreements that you've worked so hard to broker, even during a time of crisis?
Kristin, in our case, I think a lot of the people who work in conservation, actually, we had been accused to care more about the wildlife, about the forests, about the trees, and not so much about the people. And I think in an extent that is right. It's a few people who do the work like Blue Ventures that actually really the community are the center of the conservation program that they have. But I think with COVID now, we really have to rethink, work on how we are connected with communities, how we work with communities. And because I think after this crisis, community will be far more poor than now in this moment, but also they will rely far more in natural resources for the livelihoods. And also they will be really scared about us, like NGOs, social workers, government, go back to these communities and try to do the work, because we can bring COVID to many of these communities. So it's a combination of things that were actually now, I think in this moment, it put the people in the center of the conservation program and not the reverse.
Yeah, very beautifully put. And so far, are you seeing that the agreements are still being honored?
Many of the communities that we work, like we have 95% of complying on all the agreements that we have. But I don't think so it's the agreement per se. It's how to create local institutions that people can rely on those institutions and believe in them. And if this work, actually people will comply with whatever agreement they are agreed. Also, rural communities normally actually comply with whatever paper they sign on. And it's not like in the big cities when maybe you need some better control, but in the communities, just put your word into an agreement is enough.
So are you, during this time, able to think about going into new municipalities and setting up new agreements, or do you feel that your work has to pause right now?
Depends how you see conservation. For us, our program is all off in this moment, and we are really thinking and doing actually how to help them to cope with this crisis. So we have put a lot of we have like many cars in the institution, and they need cars to mobilize and to comply with the lockdown. And so we are trying to serve them with the need that they have now. The need that they have now is how to cope with the food that they don't have on the table, how to cope with the medicine that they don't have also, and how to move into the communities. So we are helping them with this lockdown to take care out into the community, and we hold off all our programs. I do add it a little bit about what Alf said before. We have been talking with many of our donors. And it's funny because all of them say, fine, we can give it extents to you to present and deliver the framework that you have to do. I will give a couple months or a year, but none of them say, I will give you money for you to carry on with these programs. And I say, fine, you give me the extent, but we need also resources, because I have legal compliance with our team. In my case, we are 80 people working in Natura. We serve 60 communities. We serve more than 7,000 farmers on the ground. And we don't want to leave them alone, and we won't leave it. Even we bankrupt as institution, we will be serving these people who need the most in this moment, and they need us. We are not in this moment a conservation entity. We are part of these communities, and we need to be with them.
Thank you. That is so well put. And I can see Leela and Al shaking their heads in agreement. I think that's one of the things that's really interesting, and perhaps is what makes all three of your organizations so successful, is not allowing yourself to be in that silo of a conservation organization, and appreciating that so much of what you do depends on recognizing all the basic needs of the communities where you work are met. Otherwise, how can they afford literally to protect the resources that they have? So Lúcia, let me switch to you for a second. So you talked, especially yesterday, about the need to change the narrative in conservation. What do you mean by change the narrative?
Well, yeah. So when I talk about changing the narrative, what I mean is that we really need to speak a language that is accessible to everyone. And we also need to convey a message of hope that actually inspires people to act. So when we look at the news, we see always like lots of horror stories about the environment. And I feel that these stories are actually scaring people away. And then when people are scared, they're actually led to despair instead of acting. And they feel sort of paralyzed. They feel like they can't do anything. Mm-hmm. And so we really need to have a narrative that is engaging and inspiring. And we also need to make sure that everyone understands that we are in this together. I mean, so everyone can make a difference, and the planet is really everyone's responsibility. And biodiversity is not something out there that somebody's gonna take care for us. No, everyone has to do their share. And once people start to really value nature and to appreciate, this is actually not a struggle. This is all that people will want to do.
So what do you think the role for science and scientists is within that effort? Because I would argue they're critical to it. They also contribute to some of that jargon and hard language to connect with that you're talking about.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that scientists in the past, they were actually not engaged in science outreach. And well, first of all, because scientists were actually not trained for that, and they just didn't know how to do it. And in fact, I mean, most scientists, they're actually introverts, and they're driven by discovering and understanding how things work. And most scientists, all they want is to just be locked in a forest or in a room, just immersed in their science, searching for solutions and communicating what they're doing. Actually, for some scientists, seems like a distraction from what they were doing. But actually, it turns out that by not doing science outreach, scientists were shooting themselves in the foot. And actually, as a result of that, perhaps, we ended up with leadership in different parts of the globe that does not really value science or the environment, which ended up being a major wake-up call and turning point for scientists, because suddenly there were major cuts to research, to universities, increased deforestation, and they started to realize that they were not really playing an important role in society. And so
let me ask, let's bring that to the current coronavirus situation. So as you've watched it evolve, including how governments and citizens have responded or not to science, evidence, models, projections, what have you learned and what are you learning that you think the association that you lead and the folks on this call can bring to conservation?
Well, so in relation to COVID, one thing that was really amazing was seeing, okay, so a lot of the scientists just stopped doing the research that they were doing and jumped to trying to find solutions that could be immediately used to solve the pandemic. And it's amazing. Even so, youth, we have a case here in Brazil. So a student who was able to produce ventilators that can be used at very low price, and now it's being used in different hospitals. And so essentially everyone stopped what they were doing and started to tackle the problem and try to find solutions and make sure that these solutions were accessible and available to everyone. And this is what we should be doing the whole time.
Great. You know, you think on a different time frame than the average person. A lot of your research focuses on how the Amazon basin and its incredible biodiversity formed during the last 50 million years. We don't have that much time to figure out how to change the narrative in conservation, and not just the narrative, but actually change conservation. What are your ideas about how to accelerate that?
Yeah, so that's usually also a problem in the sense that so science works at a different pace as some of the actions that we need to take. So some of the scientific discoveries take a long time. And But we just need to learn to focus on the key points and find the shortcuts and really focus on the crucial questions and aspects and find the ways in which science can be most useful to solving some of the current environmental issues and current debates.
Great. Maria Teresa, I want to ask you the same question about what gives you confidence and hope that the future of conservation in Bolivia is positive.
Maybe one thing is like we're still sitting in so much natural resources in Bolivia, and we are a few of us. We are 12 million people sitting in more than 1 million square kilometers, and it's still like 51% of my country covered with a beautiful natural resources. So if we understand what we have in the country, we can really like, I can live with hope. It will be crazy not to. But I think we are at a time that we need to reset our button. And I think that COVID has bring that into the table. And we can choose to reset the button just to help and say we take care now, health will be the first thing, or we can reset all our relation with nature, with poverty, with the type of development that we are pushing in our countries. And I think it's the time to really reflect and to understand what is best for society. And maybe what is best for society is not what is best for big corporations in the country, and give our resources to this big corporation. And this is a big message. We know that this pandemic has came for nature. All the pandemic in the last 30 years came because the relation that we have with natural resources. So we have to really rethink on that. And I think this is the good thing about COVID. Maybe is, you know, the threshold that we have right now in front of us to think what we'll do next. And it's good time also for us in conservation to be thinking deep and hard. Normally we don't have the time to thinking what we are doing. And I think my team now is reflecting a lot in what is next and how we really built in what happened right now, and how we do more. I would say our communities really suffer for this and they're not prepared, and how we prepare them in the future.
Thank you. I think that's such a good point, that transforming conservation is about more than transforming just conservation and the way this sector works, but also all the other sectors that it's interdependent on. Thank you, Lúcia and Maria Teresa. I'm going to bring you back into the group discussion in a minute, but I want to make sure we hear from Fred Nelson too. So Fred, unmute yourself and join us. Fred is the executive director and founder of Maliasili. Maliasili supports grassroots African conservation organizations that do critical work at the nexus of poverty and conservation. They provide ongoing, customized support to those community-based organizations to enhance their impact and performance. They have 17 partner organizations in 5 countries across Africa, and the results so far have been remarkable. Fred, I want to start with the same question. What is your organization's vision of success?
Well, we really exist to unleash that potential of great local organizations. That's what we're all about. And we believe local organizations, talented grassroots groups have the key solutions that we need, and we want to help them do more and do it better.
Great. So you find those organizations working with communities to do important work in key ecological landscapes. Are you finding your partners able to maintain their impact right now?
Well, I think, you know, our partners tend to be groups. I mean, Lion Guardians, as an example of a group we've worked with for a long time, and, you know, also the kind of work that Blue Ventures and Natura Bolivia do, you know, of developing those community-based solutions. So they are the organizations that have the infrastructure, that have the presence, that have the relationships, and their role is more important than ever. They're the organizations that that communities are turning to right now to try to find their way through this crisis.
Great. And, you know, Maria Teresa brought up the issue of funding as it specifically relates to this crisis. But I think there's a broader question about we haven't talked about money related to transforming conservation. So let's talk about money for a little bit. how does the flow of funding relate to transforming conservation?
Well, I think for us to be successful in conservation, to scale up solutions, to deliver impact on the ground, we've got to align resources and the limited resources we have with impact. We've got to get more money going to the best local organizations. That's something we're trying to do with many different partners. And maybe this crisis is an opportunity to think about how we get the most return on investment from the conservation dollars that we spend in a period where we're going to have to be more efficient and really, I think, prioritize impact if we are going to find our way out of the layered crises that we face.
And if you give a concrete example of exactly how to get funding to those organizations, like what is it? What are you doing? What do you think solutions
I mean,
are?
I think the things we do, we help network and make connections. A lot of our partners, we say they're doing some of the best work in the field, but nobody's ever heard about it. So from the beginnings of our organization, we've really placed a priority on communications. And in the last decade, the technology to level the playing field between international organizations and local organizations has really been leveled, with media and technology now. So communications is a big part of that. I think working with aligned funders, and helping them to connect as well, to collaborate. I think we need to learn from the kind of the wider social development sector and kind of the co-impact models and collaborative funding models. And we've been working to develop kind of an initial pooled funding model that can get dollars to the ground in East Africa, where they can benefit some of our partners and leading community-based conservation initiatives.
So as you think about how this crisis maybe catalyzes change in new ways of funding or new partnerships or new collaborations, I also wonder what you think it means for some traditional partners. Like, we've been talking today a lot about community-based organizations doing conservation work. There are some Goliaths out there. The big NGOs absorb a lot of resources in this sector, and certainly aspire to the same goals that everyone here is talking about. How can we bridge the divide a little bit between the community-based organizations and the big international NGOs? So it's not us versus them, but a little bit more we. How does Maliasili think about that?
Well, I think we really prioritize collaboration. We kind of try to take a systems approach, or an ecosystem level approach in terms of our field. Everyone has a role to play, right? International organizations and such as us, we're an organization with staff in the U.S. And staff in the places where we work as well. But being able to bridge where resources are and where, particularly in the tropics and developing countries where the impact needs to be made, getting resources to the ground. But I think all the international groups have a critical role to play in having strong, healthy partnerships that can support local organizations, but that may involve, reorganizing or rethinking some of the conventional ways of doing things. Partnerships and collaboration is going to be more important than ever if we're going to face up to the challenges of the present. And I think we have a good opportunity to think about that in this present moment.
Great. I know Maliasili came into 2020 with a lot of momentum. Expansion was part of your plans, some new partnerships, putting together a new fund to get money to local organizations. Do you think you can maintain that momentum through 2020 in this crisis? And how are you thinking about recapturing it no matter what?
Well, I think like everyone, it takes a little bit of time to, get your head around this strange situation that we all find ourselves within. But within a few weeks, we really realized, at first you think, okay, you got to put things on hold, or you're not going to be doing as much because you're all trapped in your homes, in your rooms. But then really we realized that this is our most important moment for our work and our mission, and our partners are going to be critical to getting their partner communities through this, but also to helping them to adapt. It's a great opportunity for rethinking existing models. It's a great opportunity for us to help our partners really, I think, rise to the top in terms of the work that they're doing and just showcase how important they are to the whole field, to impact on the ground. I think the kinds of groups that we partner with are in many ways going to thrive, just for the reasons that Leela and Al highlighted. They're the groups that are there. And so our role in supporting them is more important than ever. I also think it's a great opportunity for us to adapt and learn. And we're doing that in terms of how to work remotely and how to be more efficient in our work, and develop new tools and ways of supporting our partners that are maybe more efficient, less costly. We'll see, but I think organizations that can be agile, that can innovate, and that have that in their DNA are going to thrive at a certain level during this period.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great segue into bringing the group back together. I want to start, Alex, if you could share a very simple slide that for anyone that doesn't know Mulago, this is kind of the DNA of Mulago. Impact over time, increasing impact over time is what we're all going for. This hockey stick curve sums up hopefully everyone's theory of change in some ways. I think the real question that we have is, of course we're interested, and you've all shared a bit about how your individual solutions are going to scale. But what part of this conversation is interested in provoking a little bit is, how do we actually shift this whole curve? If we want to transform conservation, how do we make sure that we're getting greater impact more quickly from all your solutions and aggregates? So what can we do to shift the curve? I think this is the simplest way to think about what transforming conservation really means. Even transforming conservation sounds a little jargony, but what we really want to know is, how can we have more impact sooner? So I want to go back to, thanks for the slides, Alex. Go back to the group. Maria, Teresa, Al, Leela, you've all had success supporting other organizations to replicate your solution in new geographies. What's the most important thing you've learned that other leaders maybe listening to this conversation right now can do if they want to support quality replication that delivers real impact of their solution? Al, can you start us off?
Sure. We wrote a little article in Stanford Social Innovation Review last month, which somewhat captures our learning on this. And I think I could try to summarize it in 3 words that all begin in P. We're looking for grassroots organizations. They don't necessarily need to be conservation organizations in order to replicate these community-based solutions that we're sharing and in many ways learning back more about as they're adopted in new contexts. The first thing we're looking for is presence. Are those organizations there? Do they have that grassroots credibility that Fred talks about, that is going to be become ever so clear and apparently important now in this sector, when the northern model, when the international, when the frequent flyer conservation model is no longer viable? The second is permanence. Are they there on a generational timescale? Are they there to work with and alongside a community as it navigates the challenges that it's going to face within a market or when it's managing an ecosystem? And the third is are they proximate to those issues, the often sensitive questions around livelihood, around health, around behavior change in managing, in our case, a fishery or interaction with these apex predators? These are the characteristics that we're looking for in these superstar organizations that we're supporting. And I hope that the incredible value that these groups bring to conservation will be put into sharp relief during this crisis. Indeed, I'm sure that it will be.
Great, thank you. Leela, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, those were all, I would say, the same thing as you, and I'll just add a couple more points to what
Tell
Al
us,
just said.
maybe to start, how many, in how many countries have people adopted part of your solution, or how many other parts of the world?
So I'd say about 15 different sites, maybe 12 of them in Africa, Southern Africa, Eastern Africa.
Great.
Recently, we did something in India with tigers, and then South America.
Great.
So it's been really great. And I think that, everything that Al said, plus we really look at leadership, right? Is leadership strong enough to be able to, are they visionary, strategic thinkers? Are they collaborative, right? Are they compassionate and good people? right? I mean, that's really important, because if they're not, like, nobody really wants to work with them. Are they ethical, right? These are really big things, because we don't want to waste time either, because we don't have the time. So we look for that. And I think, you know, just on our side, being able to share our knowledge, we had to get to a certain space where we were vulnerable enough to share our failures and say, you know, so we kind of created a safe space where we could say, well, these really didn't work. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on this, and we really wouldn't want you to go through that because it just didn't work. And I think you get there when you're in a secure space, right? When you as an organization are there. And I think you don't really know when you're there until you're there. That's what I would say to other people, you
That's
know?
great. Great.
So,
That's
yeah.
great. I think a lot of what you and Al both said around alignment for partner selection does come down to, do you have the same mission? But that alignment is so important. Maria Teresa, would you like to add anything about how you've been able to find aligned partners in other countries to scale the reciprocal water agreement model?
You know, the way how we work is mainly with the municipalities and some NGO partners in the region. And for us, I think, remember that to scale, you need many things. One thing is who will scale, who are the segment or the sector or the person who will scale your idea. And in this case, I think it's really important how easy is what you are proposing to do other people. Yeah, and I think the tool that we develop is easy enough that it can be adopted and should be adopted for any like local authority and even other NGOs, because water is a resource needed for adaptation to climate change, but it's also an input for production and is needed for rural people and for drinking purposes. So we find actually that if something will affect you personally, you will act. And I think water is something like that. It will affect you personally if you don't do nothing there.
Yes.
So this is why I think it's so important that whatever you do is easy enough so some people can adopt it. And of course, you need the leadership, you need the resources, and you need the right people on the ground to implement.
I couldn't agree more. And actually, thank you for that prompt. One of Mulago's favorite ways of talking about what you need to ask yourself about how your solution is going to get to scale is who's going to do it and who's going to pay for it. The doer and the payer. And if you start thinking about how your solution will have a clear doer and payer at scale early on and design towards that, there are things you can do early on in scaling your solution to really make it more likely that you get to that doer and payer one day. Fred, let me ask you a question. Maybe broader, kind of bringing it up a notch to think about how you really get that shift in the curve to transform conservation. What do you see as a great unharnessed opportunity in conservation? We know that you see community-based organizations as a vehicle to achieve it, but what else do you see as a great unharnessed opportunity?
Well, maybe I think there's two things to really highlight. I feel there's two revolutions we need. One is this community revolution. And I think we've seen that to a large degree. And one of the biggest changes, we want to think about positive transformative changes in the conservation field the last 20, 30 years, is the role of communities, the role of indigenous people, the recognition of the incredibly disproportionate area of land and biodiversity on indigenous lands, on community lands, particularly in the tropics, and how important that is. Like that's been mainstreamed, and I think we need to now figure out how do you really invest in those solutions, in those management systems, in an effective and durable way. And the other revolution is this impact revolution. And again, really maybe drawing lessons from the wider social development sector, it's funny, often in conservation, there's a lot of science and a lot of focus on numbers, but yet the conservation field hasn't really been that metric driven, that impact driven, really in terms of what's the return on investment in terms of the conservation outcomes. And again, I think if we're going to drive that curve up, we've got to be investing in the right solutions and with the right kind of support that actually delivers impact on the ground.
Great. I think, Lúcia, that's a good ball over to you. How can the conservation sector think more about metrics that actually help people understand its impact?
Well, yeah, that's a very good point. And I mean, a key thing is really to consider very multidisciplinary approaches in which we consider different communities and we consider different fields. And so really integrating the academic sector with the conservation world, with society at large, with governments and local communities. So we can really think about metrics that apply to everyone and not just to a single sector, which is usually what happens. Usually people are in their own sector and they just see their own values as being a priority. So again, diverse voices, making sure that we have a planet that is that has resources available to everyone and that integrates everyone's interests.
Thank you. So, so what's come through so clearly is the great work that all of your organizations are doing, particularly around buttressing the existing power of local communities as natural guardians and stewards. It sounds innovative when we talk about it today, but the truth is, we said Blue Ventures was founded in 2003, Lion Guardians in 2007. This is not new, right? So why hasn't community-led conservation scaled more? Other than the funding reason, maybe. Like, Leela, what are the barriers? What are the barriers that you think we face in making this part of a transformed version of conservation?
Well, I mean, I'll just I liked your curve. It's very simple, right? And it's like, what is that? What is that? What do we need to have that shift? And for me, transformative conservation is so tied to more women moving into leadership space. I think just in the last couple of years, I've kind of just seen this shift happen. Like, I think we're owning kind of our own authentic leadership style more. We're role modeling it every day. Our voices are stronger than they were before. And I think it's because there's a sense of community, right, that has come. And there are more women moving into that space. So I think part of that is that there has been an imbalance, a gender imbalance at the leadership level. Like, so if you think about in Africa, for example, in conservation in Africa, less than 5% of all the leadership, the top leadership positions are held by women. Like, that's a problem, right? And so I think as we start to think, when we're thinking about working with communities, collaboration, all of these are like very strong values that women hold, right? And so I think that's a kind of untapped potential that we need to start moving into in conservation, start realizing that, women are ready. There is a community for them, there's a support for them. And I mean, there's two organizations that I've helped found that is really targeting this in Africa, because we do feel like this is a space that needs it. One is Pride Lion Conservation Alliance, which people can look it up or something because we don't have a lot of time. But I mean, basically, it's about collaboration, and particularly around a single species where usually there's a lot of competition and nastiness. And then the other one is Women for the Environment Africa, or We Africa. And so that's another kind of movement toward trying to change these norms, these conservation norms that have to happen.
I think that's a great answer. Changing norms, forming alliances to do it. Al, I'm going to ask you maybe the flip side of that question. So yes, it's been since 2003, and there's maybe still a long way to go. But when you think about the evolution since then, are there reasons? Do you think we're in a better place? Are we in a better place than we were in 2003?
In terms of the progression of community management, we're in a completely different world, Kristin. It's extraordinary to see the growth. Of course, that's against a background of accelerating climate change and now annual, for example, extreme thermal heat stress events on coral reefs, which are causing bleaching. The challenges we're up against are now truly existential. But the revolution that we've seen in locally led marine conservation is unprecedented. And so I would wholeheartedly disagree with your notion that, your question, why hasn't it been quicker? It couldn't have been quicker, or perhaps it could have been quicker, and I'm happy to reflect on some of the ways it could have been even quicker. But we see thousands of square kilometers of ocean now being managed by communities. Local or co-management approaches are the primary entry point on any RFP, on any funding application, on any call for fisheries work or conservation work in the Indian Ocean today. That is explicit recognition by funders, by governments, by NGOs of the primacy of local leadership in conservation. However, often I would say that we do only pay lip service to that. Delivery of those aspirational approaches is often not present, permanent, or proximate. It is often driven by absentee organizations with money spent far too quickly, for example, using those more dysfunctional approaches that come out of the old school of operating afar, drive-by conservation, which isn't empowering communities in the spirit of community conservation. I would also highlight the point that Leela made about capacity gaps. Community conservation is hard. It requires local leadership, and these are some of the most underserved communities on earth, struggling with poverty, struggling with livelihoods that are not doing well. So we absolutely have to recognize the importance of investment in capabilities and capacity at a local level, both of communities and of the organizations that are supporting them, which is why the work of Maliasili is so fundamental to the conservation movement in Africa and groups like Maliasili in other parts of the world. And also there are governance barriers. The legal frameworks that devolve power to local communities are often not robust. They're often obscure. They can be complicated. They can take millions of dollars and decades to navigate. And that can often be really, really complicated. And in the meantime, an industrial fishing trawler has just gone straight through because it still could and undone all those decades of good work. So there's a lot more that we could be doing to accelerate further. But please don't think that we haven't, that the movement is not already marching on, because it is on the J curve. I
knew you were an optimist, Al. I knew it. Good. Well, we do have a few questions. We don't have much time. A lot of the questions were around financing, and so I hope that the speakers address those. We're almost out of time. I want to give everyone just 20 seconds, maybe 25, but maybe 15. Just really simply, I just want you to say the mission of your organization again and why you believe you'll succeed, but in a sentence. Fred, why don't you start?
Our mission is to support great local conservation organizations, do what they do better and deliver more impact. And I believe we'll succeed because they'll succeed.
Great, wonderful. Leela.
Okay, so our mission is to conserve lions and preserve local cultures. And I think we're going to succeed because we are already succeeding. We just need to keep doing it, and we need to continue to spread it so that we can ensure others succeed in other places.
Great, wonderful. Lúcia.
So we are a global scientific organization, and our mission is to promote research, education, science outreach, and conservation in the tropical regions of the globe. And so we are already succeeding in training the next generation of leaders in tropical biology and conservation, and trying to get the message out and impact policy and science outreach as much as we can.
Great. Teresa.
We help communities to protect water sources. This is our mission. And we are where we are because we are with them, and we are Starwood, and we care about what they care. And water is a base resource for them. And with water, we protect biodiversity. We protect far more other things.
Great. And Al?
We rebuild tropical fisheries with coastal communities, and it's going to work because there isn't an investment opportunity on Earth that can deliver the returns that fisheries can.
Wonderful. A good note of optimism. I have a lot of confidence all of you are going to succeed in those missions. Thank you so much to everyone online for joining us today. There were more than 125 or 30 people on, I think. And I had great fun being part of this conversation. This isn't the end. Thank you everyone for the work you do. Happy 50th Earth Day.